Well, welcome to second week of our class Ethics, Philosophy 2329. Let me adjust the screen here. First of all, thank you for some of you who said that the sound quality in my last recording, my apologies, wasn't so good. I was in my elder son's room and the vent from the air conditioner apparently interrupted or interfered with the sound. My bad. This time I'm in my bedroom and no vents, no fans that are overly loud. I hope the sound quality is better. So this week we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill, 19th century British philosopher. You should probably print the outline for Mill that's in the file section of Canvas. I'm going to stick to that pretty religiously. And then at the half-hour mark, whether or not we're finished with Mill, I'll sum that up and move to Singer. Singer's an Australian philosopher, splits his time between his home country and Princeton in New Jersey. Has this very famous article where he uses a form of utilitarianism to talk about animal rights. Let's just jump right in. Again, you should have the Mill outline and probably the Singer outline when we get to the halfway point. If you need to see or watch this lecture in different chunks or sittings, by all means. I can't sit through an hour and listen to someone else talk, so maybe you do this in 15 or 20 minutes, take a break, come back to it a little later, and so on. It's up to you, right? It's however, whatever schedule works for you. So let's go to my home screen and I will get the outline for Mill. Voila. Okay, so as I said, 19th century British philosopher. I'm going to do A through E anyway, and if we don't get to F, we don't get to F on this outline. Mill was a child prodigy, spoke several languages, at a very tender age, was involved in British politics, wrote widely on logic and economics and political philosophy. In fact, we'll read his On Liberty essay later in the summer semester or the full-length semester, depending on when you're watching this video. The theory in front of us today, utilitarianism, is a consequentialist or teleological theory. That first word just means what it sounds like. He focuses on consequences. That doesn't mean that he's not interested in your intentions, your character, and so on. It's just that the primary focus of the theory is to look at outcomes or consequences. Teleological just means goal-oriented. So if you meet any utilitarians, I knew a woman in college, dated a woman in college, who called herself a utilitarian and said she was always trying to maximize utils, which is to say utility, which is to say, well, we'll see, happiness or pleasure. If you look at chapter 2, paragraph 3, I'm going to quote from that. We're going to spend a couple minutes on this quote and then dive into what Mill means by happiness. So in chapter 2, paragraph 3, Mill writes, the creed, belief, which accepts as the foundation of morals, so what's most important, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. So I'm going to say a few words about each of those words so we can unpack that definition. So obviously he's a utilitarian in the sense that he wants to promote the greatest happiness out there. And by out there, it would be anybody who feels it. And the buddy might not be a human being. It could be any creature. And we'll see that with Singer, who's focused on producing more pleasure even in the animal kingdom. And you can object to that later when we get there. But that's kind of the idea. Mill writes here that actions are right. So he is more focused on what you do and perhaps less focused on what you think, because it's actions in his view that causes the outcomes that are bad or good. Actions are right. That's a moral word, so morally right, in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. So the more they promote happiness, the more moral they are. You might think of this as a light dimmer switch. So the more some action you do promotes happiness, in that respect, mathematically, it's more moral. The tend word is important because utilitarians owe us, you, anybody who wants to understand the theory, an explanation of how things cause or tend happiness. So if something is unlikely to produce happiness, to that extent it wouldn't be moral. If something tends to or generally does produce happiness, to that extent it would be moral. Now the second half of this definition, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse, is important too. Because, as we'll see in a moment, no act itself is going to produce happiness for everybody. There are always trade-offs and downsides and costs. So what the utilitarian is going to say here is, sure, your activity, I'll pick grandma and the fruitcake in a minute, which might produce happiness for you or for 6 others or 10 others, might make 2 unhappy. Insofar as the net balance of what you're doing produces more happiness than less. In that extent and to that extent, it is a moral act. So back to grandmother, my late grandmother on my dad's side actually was a fruitcake maker. And when I lived in New York, she would come for the holidays. She had 7 kids, so she moved around. And when she came to our place, she had a fruitcake. And my parents always said, tell her you like it, tell her it's delicious. And it was awful. It was just really, really, really disgusting. So here's the trick. 2 situations. I tell the truth straight up. This is disgusting. I hate it or whatever. I feel good because I'm not shading the truth or lying. Grandma might feel like, wow, really? And my parents will be upset I didn't lie. My siblings are saying you ruined Christmas. I'm not saying it's totally just, but on that calculation, when I say it's disgusting, it doesn't look like I produced a lot of happiness. On the other hand, I could tell a little white lie. I don't have to go over the top and say it's the best thing I've ever had. I could say, fruitcake, or thank you, Grandma, nice fruitcake. Am I really telling the truth? No, I don't like it. She's happy that one of her grandkids likes her fruitcake. My parents are happy I haven't angered Grandma. My siblings don't have to deal with a ruined Christmas. You might argue with those 2 scenarios, the net balance of happiness suggests tell the little white lie. Okay, so that's just one way of applying the theory. Mill owes us more than that, though, and I'm in section D of your handout. Mill also owes us what he means by happiness. And if you think about it, and I haven't looked in the dictionary, there are probably tons and tons of words that would be cognates or synonyms for happiness. Joy, pleasure, pleasantness. I don't know what the heck they are. So what Mill's going to give us, and this is going to take us a little while in section D, is what he means when he says things are moral insofar as they promote happiness. First thing he does, and this is D1 on your handout, if you look at chapter 2, paragraph 5, he wants to say that other writers, again, not him, have already made the case, the argument, that certain pleasures, mental, you could think of, thinking, spiritual pleasures, musical pleasures, artistic creations, right, the pleasures you get from those. Other writers have made the argument that the superiority of the mental over the bodily are chiefly in their greater permanency, safety, and uncostliness. Okay, so Mill doesn't disagree with that. He just thinks there's more to it. So just to be clear, Mill's agreeing that mental pleasures are more permanent, more safe, and less costly than the physical. If you think about it, you might make that argument along with Mill. Are mental pleasures more permanent? You can return to them again and again, right? I happen to be a big science fiction fan, and I do watch Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica, and each time they're fun, right? They don't really lose anything, or even just thinking about them can be enjoyable. So more permanent compared to, say, physical pleasures. Let's pretend this is vodka and I'm drunk. It's water. It might be that you get a little high off of being drunk, but not very permanent, right? A couple hours maybe, and then of course there's the hangover. So safe, you might think of certain physical pleasures, sex comes to mind, as potentially being unsafe, maybe now, especially during COVID-19. But mental pleasures, I can revisit them. It doesn't seem they're very dangerous, just sitting in my chair thinking about poetry or music or listening to poetry or music and so on. Costliness, well, you might debate this. Certainly educations are not inexpensive, although over a lifetime, every economist says they pay off and then some. But physical pleasures, do they have a cost? Again, drinking, smoking, sex, there are sort of physical costs to those things, right? When not done properly or done safely or whatever. But again, Mill's point here is not that he alone thinks, or he mostly thinks, that the mental pleasures, spiritual, artistic, those kinds of things, are better just because of these reasons. He says other thinkers got that right. Good for them. He's going to say something else. So in D1, on your outline, what still remains to be said? Well, Mill's about to say it in the chapter 2, paragraph 6. This is his so-called competent judges section. So he wants to say, anyone who's competently acquainted with both, sufficiently familiar, with both, who's had them enough, doesn't say what enough is, we can talk about that, or had them enough times, they're well aware from immediate experience to say which one is, and this is important, intrinsically better in and of itself. So intrinsically doesn't mean they give you more money if you have them, like if you get a better degree and you get a better job, or they're more permanent. Those were the sort of outcomes that he said other writers got. What he wants to say is the intellectual, spiritual pleasures are intrinsically better than the physical ones, sex, drugs, that kind of thing. And so, how does he know this? Well, the argument is you got to have both. And not just once, you have to be sufficiently familiar with them to make the case that from immediate experience, you think one of them is intrinsically better. And part of his answer, and this is D2 little a in your outline, is anyone who's experienced both enough, so familiar with them enough, done them enough, is going to say that, this is paragraph 7, there's a certain kind of dignity, and that's his word, that comes with experiencing and valuing the mental pleasures, spiritual, intellectual, musical, over the other kinds of pleasures, the physical ones. So the argument here would be something like this. I'm 55, so I'll just admit it. Been out a lot, drank a lot, maybe I did some illegal drugs in my life. Not going to admit to that under, I've done it enough, right? Also, went to college, went to grad school, read a lot of books. Pretty familiar with the physical side, pretty familiar with the mental side. Which one's really in and of itself better? Which one makes for a more dignified life as a human being? I'm not just saying this because I'm a philosopher. I think the intellectual, spiritual, musical ones make me a better person. Now, that doesn't mean I'm always happier to have them, right? Doesn't mean I'm always in a better place. Anyone who's ever majored in something or tried a musical instrument or tried to lead a spiritual, religious life, it's hard. It takes practice. There are a lot of mistakes. There are joys, too, when you get it right, whatever that means. So Mill's argument here about this is if you've had both of them enough, doesn't say what enough is, but got to be a couple times, I imagine, you're going to say, if asked, raising your hand, yes or no, that the intellectual, spiritual, emotional, musical pleasures make you more a dignified human being. And if you don't, well, this is D2B in my outline. If you disagree with that, he says, well, I don't know what I can say to you, among other things, because you've had them enough and you're still going to vote like, oh, the physical are intrinsically better, right? Totally make you more dignified. I mean, it's not like he can stop you from thinking that or voting that way. And it's the experience of the pleasures, the experiential knowledge that tells you whether or not, right, something makes you more dignified as a human being. But Mill's going to make, and this is a very interesting and somewhat famous, as in you see it on Jeopardy kind of claim, Mill's going to say, and this is paragraph 8, if you disagree, you think the physical pleasures are actually better in the sense of intrinsically in and of themselves, more dignified to have as a human being. Socrates replies, and here's the phrase, it's better to be, Mill, confused the names, Mill, reaching back thousands of years to ancient Greek philosophy, says, it's better to be Socrates, intellectually rich and in a dignified way, better to be Socrates dissatisfied with the mental pleasures than, and these are his words, a fool, or a pig satisfied with the physical ones. What does that mean? Take a step back, and his answer is this. You're sufficiently aware of both kinds of pleasures. You've had a life of physical and intellectual. Intellectual is still hard. Forget about what other writers said that we talked about before, right? Permanence and safety. Still hard to get. Maybe just fleeting aha moments. If you're in the sciences or the arts, or you're in business, you have a aha moment when you finally figure out the answer to a difficult accounting problem. Better yet, to have a life of being a Socrates, smart person, who's dissatisfied with how things are going, but you're trying to sort it out, you're trying to have a dignified life. Better to be that person than a person who gets all the physical pleasures that he or she wants. Because to have that life is to be a fool or a pig. Fool, you've got your priorities wrong. Pig, you're not leading a dignified life. You're leading a life of swine, right? A life of animals that allegedly only know the physical pleasures. So that's kind of his definition of what morality is in C and what he means by happiness. If you find D a little confusing, you're not alone. I'm going to go down on my outline a little bit. Plenty of people that read Mill say something like this. Pleasure is pleasure is pleasure. In fact, his teacher, Jeremy Bentham, said as much. Why distinguish between different kinds? If somebody, and this is Bentham, likes poetry and someone else likes a game like soccer, right, or drinking, what's it to you? And there is an argument to be made there. I think what Mill's trying to do here is save the theory from the view that all happiness is equal, but he has this impression or intuition or belief, maybe you do too, that some pleasures are intrinsically better for making us a dignified kind of human being. When I'm in my face-to-face classes, I often stop here and on the board list mental pleasures, music, poetry, sciences, accounting. I was an accountant once, so yes, I'm including that. And all the other intellectual pursuits, spiritual pursuits, musical pursuits. And on the other half of the board, I put down sources of physical pleasure, sex, drinking, drugs. I'm not really sure what else to put out. And then I say, okay, class, raise your hand. So if you've had both sufficiently well, so you sort of get how they go, raise your hand if you think it's more dignified to have a life of the intellectual ones, by and large, more or less. Not that you're going to give up on the physical, right? Mill's not saying you can't have physical pleasures. What he's saying is the life of the human being that's promoting happiness for others and him or herself is more dignified if it's attaining or at least achieving sometimes the mental. And usually in a class of 30, I get 21 or 22 people that raise their hand and say, oh yeah, that makes me more dignified. That's better intrinsically, even if sometimes you're dissatisfied because they're hard. And then I'll have 4 or 5 people that go, no, physical's better. They make you more of a human being. And I'm like, okay. I don't know what to say to you. Maybe you haven't had enough, or you haven't experienced it enough, or you might be right. I don't know. And then there are a couple undecideds. I'm not saying that vote settles the matter, but I'm saying that in class, that's kind of how it breaks down. Here's some other features of Mill's theory. I want to move on to E. And in E, these are kind of sprinkled throughout the second chapter. So if you don't see these right away, don't worry about it. I'm going to sort of list them here so you just have a better sense of how the theory holds together. So E1, and he says this in paragraph 13, who counts on this theory? In my business, philosophers call this moral standing. If you're a pre-law, you'll understand what legal standing is. Hold on a second. Casper, it's my dog. Sorry, he's kind of freaking out in the bed. Legal standing is you have a right to sue. You've been harmed in the relevant way. So if, I'm trying to think, I punch my son in the nose, my elder son, and he breaks his nose, my next door neighbor can't sue. He hasn't really been harmed. My elder son, Liam, can. Here, in the case of morality, who morally counts? Well, Mill tells us in paragraph 13, all of sentient creation. By sentience, he means capable of pain or pleasure. So my iPhone, at least the way it's been built today, it's not an AI with sentience. It doesn't feel anything. I don't do a moral wrong, at least to the phone. Maybe I do to, someone if they gave it to me or I borrow money for it. But if I break the phone, I haven't done a moral wrong to the phone. But what this means, in addition to human beings, is anything that is sentient counts, because after all, the goal here of the theory, the consequential theory, is to promote happiness or pleasure, higher and lower. Physical pleasures count too, they're just not intrinsically better, right? So my dog Casper, who's pretty bright actually, you might argue, I won't go to the mat for this, is mostly interested in physical pleasure, right? Food, running around in the backyard, that kind of thing. If he's sentient, and everyone I think agrees the dog is capable of pleasure or pain, he counts. So he's got to be part of the moral calculus or consideration. 2, this is E2. Mill says in paragraph 22, what is the approach you're supposed to have when you're making a decision about promoting morality? Happiness or pleasure, right? Impartiality. And the relevant sentence here is, utilitarianism requires him or her, right, to be as strictly impartial, as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, impartiality we get, right? Making moral decisions, no one thinks you're supposed to be biased, right? I don't get to say my son counts for 2 when I'm making a decision, whereas like you count for 1. Well, unless it's about maybe buying him food or whatever. But the idea is if we're promoting happiness in general, I can't say his happiness is 10 times more important than yours, right? To be impartial means everybody counts once. Disinterested, I'm supposed to pretend like I don't have any skin in the game when I'm making a moral decision. Again, that's going to vary by case, right? But you don't want people to be so biased that they're interested in one outcome over another. And benevolent, I want to promote, that means, having good motives or good outcomes. I want to promote happiness. A benevolent person wants other people to be happy. And that's why this standard is, don't be biased, don't have any skin in the game necessarily, and see what would produce the best outcome. Number 3 is my parse, the first 4 lines in E3 here, of what he says in paragraph 11, which is the goal of the theory is to promote the greatest amount of happiness altogether. What that means, and this is my rendering here in E3, so nothing makes everyone everywhere happy, right? Nothing. Since there are always some people not happy when you are, the theory should insist on a net balance of happy creatures. That is, that take those made happy and those that not, and hopefully there's more that are made happy. So, sorry, my dog's he's rolling around on the bed. This is kind of funny. I'll just use that. Okay, I'm sure letting him roll around on the bed, right, is going to annoy my teenager in the next room who's trying to play video games. And, you can hear Casper. And I'm thinking, okay, so here's my decision. And it might be annoying you too, watching this lecture. Is it important enough to make him stop? It's only going to last for a minute. You're not going to be that put out. Liam's going to go back to his game. Usually Casper's done this in 3 or 4 minutes. Clearly it's making him happy. He's doing that roll around on the back and put your paws in the air. Yeah, you just... I'm sorry. Are you done, Casper? Okay. He clearly enjoys that little back scratchy thing he does. So his happiness counts. It's not really making my son, it's already over. It's just a minute or 2 in. I'm happy just for a minute. I kind of got some enjoyment out of it. I probably could poll the class and ask you to email me and say, anyone really upset that he made this noise? Here it goes again. This back scratching noise in the middle of the lecture. And I'm betting if you're not a pet person, you're like, it didn't really put me out. The method here, and this is E3, is take those who are unhappy or angry or sad, whatever displeasure they have. Oh, see, he's already done. Now he's going to go back to his cage. And take those that are made happy by it, and you want a net gain of more happy than not. And again, that's got to include any creature who's sentient. Now that I've said how the theory is, what its main features are, and how it might work, the natural question is, wow, this is really hard, right? And I'm in the objection section. We'll do a couple of these, and then I'll move on to Singer. Yes, you would think, how am I supposed to figure out 8 billion people on the planet, my actions promoting more happiness for living, sentient, feeling creatures than not? I mean, just even thinking about it would boggle the mind, right? Wow. Yeah, that's a decent objection. And in some fashion, here in F, all of these objections sort of address that. That is, this just can't work. In Mill, you might think this is strategic, or maybe he's just being a good philosopher and telling you, I see the objections you might make, the holes in my theory. I'm going to try to address those. So what Mill does, maybe we should do 1, 4, and 5. I think that'll take us to about a half hour. Is he right? Right? Is this theory so difficult, so demanding, so off-putting that it'd be great if it had a moral theory that said produce as much happiness as you can, by and large. But if it's that hard or that difficult or that off-putting, the theory fails to be practical. And Mill doesn't think that's the case. He thinks it does work. So first objection is in paragraphs 8 and 9. If this is such a good theory, one might say, why do people, apparently willingly, choose the lower pleasures so much? That is, if the higher pleasures, the mental, the spiritual, the musical, are really intrinsically better, even if you can be dissatisfied with them because they're hard, why is it that people devote so much of their lives, maybe exclusively, I think I'm paraphrasing Mill here, to the lower pleasures? Mill wants to say, and this is very interesting, in paragraphs 8 and 9, they don't really do so willingly. And he has an organic metaphor here. He says that humans are like a tender plant, and that if they're not nurtured and cared for, they lose the capacity to feel the higher pleasures. So you might think of it something like this. Let's assume that college, I'm hoping for every one of you at least a couple times, if not a lot, is in fact a time of experiencing intellectual pleasures that make you intrinsically feel like a dignified human being. Even when you don't get your major, even when you take gen ed stuff that maybe this class, right, that's difficult, there's something about the learning experience, the aha moment, the light bulb going off that makes you think, I'm a better person because of it, even if it's hard and frustrating. If that's the case, my guess is, and I hope this is true, you've been encouraged at an early age to go to school, and you had, parents and siblings, or maybe teachers and mentors and coaches that encouraged you to go on, help provide support for that, mental, financial, spiritual support. In other words, the tender plant everyone in this room was given, light, and food, and fertile soil. In other words, we had the means, the opportunity to go on to college. Not everyone has that, right? And it may be a life that doesn't have a lot of early education or spiritual formation or musical love of music. Doesn't leave many opportunities, right? If you have to work 20 hours a week, 20 hours a day just to pay the bills, where's the time for poetry or music or whatever? And I think what Mill's saying here in 8 and 9, if people seem to choose the lower pleasures willingly, it may be they just weren't encouraged early enough and provided the means early enough to do so. You can decide if he's wrong about that. I'm going to do 4 and 5 and then switch to Singer. So is it a godless doctrine? I'm Catholic, but Mill says in paragraph 26, no, trying to promote pleasure for other people is exactly what Jesus of Nazareth would have done. This seems a little fast, right? I don't know that Jesus would have been a utilitarian pleasure over pain calculator, but his argument there would be Jesus certainly wanted people to be happy, whether that's spiritually happy or physically happy. You could decide if he's being sort of too quick or fast and furious with his terms there. The one that I really want to hit, for a second, is number 5. We don't have time before we act to do a net utilitarian calculation. This is paragraph 28. So you might imagine something like this. You're driving down the street, this is before or after pandemic, you want a coffee. So you go to a drive-through coffee place, maybe it's Starbucks, I don't know. And you get a coffee, and then they put up a sign saying we're all out of French roast, whatever it is. Did you do something wrong there? So coffee made you happy. Person serving you got paid, makes them happy. But the next person in line maybe wanted French roast. They're not going to be happy with it. Maybe there are 5 people in the line who want French roast. Now they have to go down the street to the next coffee shop or skip it. So now you have a net calculation of, well, I don't know. I mean, before I act, how can I know that what I'm doing, by and large, has a net increase in happiness? And if it's that difficult to do for coffee, imagine for the big decisions in life. Like, where do I go to school, and what job do I have, and should I get married, or should I have kids, or should I travel? So it seems like it's just too darn difficult, especially beforehand. And Mill says, and this is an analogy in paragraph 28, that's like saying to somebody, you have to read the entire nautical atlas, almanac, before you make a trip. Or like saying to a religious person, you have to read your whole holy text front to back before you decide what to do. And of course, the answer to that is that's foolish, right? We have thousands of years of human history and experience with travel or religion to know there are rules of thumb, there are guidebooks, there are principles. Other people have helped figure it out, and they've passed along their wisdom to us. So back to the coffee. Is it really that difficult? No, probably we have enough experience with coffee places to know that maybe it's another 5 minutes before they roast another batch. Or because it's Starbucks or wherever, and there are 8 of them, within a city block, you could drive 2 more minutes, it's not a big deal, and get your French roast. So do we have time before we act to do the calculation? Sure, because we have others' experiences and wisdom to turn to. All right, so I'm going to stop here for a moment, give people a chance to catch their breath. Go check on Casper. I have a feeling he's stalking the postal carrier who comes to the door right about now. And we're going to do Singer when I come back. So let's take a minute, and then we'll come back and do some Singer. Okay, I'm back. And in fact, yes, that was Casper giving the postal carrier a difficult time. I don't know, he's just very protective. Okay, so Peter Singer. We'll do, how much will we do? Well, we'll at least get to some of the implications here in D. We may not be able to do the whole thing before I wear you out with this lecture. And again, you can take this in chunks. You don't have to do all at once. Do 10 minutes, do 20. Don't have to do it all the same day. So Peter Singer, as I said, Australian philosopher, always part-time at Princeton University in New Jersey, wrote this article, I want to say in the 70s. It's been used in textbooks. I've seen it in newspapers and in magazines. I had a lot of people I knew growing up, especially in college and grad school, that this article converted to vegetarianism. Excuse me. I'm not going to reveal one way or the other where I stand on that. I will say that my girlfriend and partner is a vegan, so she and I have had discussions about this article. It's pretty well known. I want to make sure as we're reading it, and this warning was in the Canvas syllabus, that we don't read Singer's position in any straw person kind of way. In other words, we don't ascribe to him a position that the article itself does not entail or does not make. Right? It's too similar to say something like, and I've taught this article before, and this is what happens. Well, does Peter Singer drive a car? And if he drives a car and he hits a squirrel, then this article's wrong. Well, you know, I drive a car, my girlfriend's car, and don't like the fact that it pollutes, and my brothers that have asthma, so I guess my driving the car is helping to kill them. But you kind of drive a car, right? If you live in a city, you live in the U.S., I can be against the pollution the car puts out and the asthma that it marginally contributes to, although my siblings live in other states, and still think I can act in other ways to reduce pollution and therefore aggravate the asthma of my brothers and sisters. So merely because Peter Singer is not perfectly consistent in every way with his life in so far as protecting animals doesn't mean he might be, that he's definitely wrong here. He does make some arguments, in this article that you should contend with. And if you want to object to him, you should object to what it says here, not that he's not a moral perfectionist, which, of course, none of us would be, I imagine, in his private life. So, main claim, and I didn't indicate earlier when we talked about Mill, that Singer's a utilitarian like Mill. Much like Mill, Singer focuses on producing pleasure, or a net balance of pleasures over pains, and avoiding pain as the central task. Singer will talk about, when he quotes Bentham in C4 below here, sentience, which is his standard for morality about who counts, right? Who counts in our moral system. But unlike Mill, Singer's less focused on the so-called higher or intrinsically better pleasures. For Singer, pleasure, mental or physical. So you're not going to see Singer say something like this. The mental pleasures are intrinsically better and make us more dignified. And my guess is he doesn't say that because he doesn't believe it. That it seems kind of weird that some pleasures that you're dissatisfied with are better because they make you more dignified. Maybe that's just too mysterious for Singer. It could be he doesn't go with that because he thinks that gives people who are critics of vegetarian an inroad, that you're supposed to produce certain kinds of pleasures and not others. Although that doesn't necessarily follow from Mill either, because Mill says they all count. Some are just intrinsically better. But it's important to think that Singer does not have the distinction in mind, right? He's just going to talk about pleasures wherever they come from and pains wherever they come from. His moral claim about equality, and you should look at the title here, Equality for Animals. He doesn't think some things about equality because it's a moral claim. It's not a scientific one. And he does think other things. His moral claim about equality is not that we're all the same. Of course we're not. Or that we should be treated exactly the same. No one really seriously thinks that, right? I mean, to use an example of Singer's in the fuller version of this article, my dogs don't get to vote, right? They're not citizens. They can't pull the switch or, punch card or whatever, right? That's beyond them. And that's not wrong for me to deny them the right to vote. Clearly, we have different abilities and talents. I'm in C1, and characteristics, right? Some of you are probably terrific athletes, me, not so much. Right? Some of you are probably great scientists and musicians. Again, me, not so much. So we're not saying with equality that we're all the same or that everybody of different talents needs to be treated the same. I'm on C2 now, and I'm summarizing the intro for Singer. Just because someone belongs to a different race or is less intelligent means that we cannot, that's a snafu, huh? Because someone belongs to a different race, that means that we cannot, I don't know what happened there. I was reading from two different texts. Cannot should not disregard their interests. For example, if St. Ed's wanted to hire another philosophy professor, it's possible, and I told you, friend, student, neighbor, that I only nodded another white male colleague, regardless of talent, you'd probably go, whoa, one, racist, you might get a person of color who's like way more talented. Also sexist, you might get a woman or a transgender person who's like way more talented. So why would you think that was fair? In fact, what you would say to me in this hypothetical, thank you, this racist and sexist behavior or belief that I'm only going to hire somebody who's white male like me, disregards the interests of other qualified applicants. So if you're a qualified applicant and you're applying to St. Ed's, you don't want someone to say, sorry, you're a person of color, or sorry, your orientation is not the same, or your biological gender, or your height. What you want them to say is, here's my application, good teacher, good researcher, good colleague, come on board, right? We'll make you an offer. So if that's what's at stake, and Singer thinks you're going to agree to that, he's going to push that a little further and say that actually covers the way we should treat non-human animals, right? So just to tell you the path of the argument that he's about to lay out. I'm on C3 here. Singer goes on to claim that what matters in regarding in an equal or fair way the interests of others, creatures, oh man, I got to proofread, creatures, did I cut that right? No, I didn't type it right. Is not how smart they are. Of course, that's no basis for treating people fairly or unfairly. Like only smart people get to be, I don't know, get to vote, or get to buy a house, or get to go to school, right? Or how they like us because, or whether they are like us because they're white or male. Again, no one thinks for that's the fair way of treating people. By and large, right? If I was casting the Spike Lee's film Malcolm X, and one of my white friends from college who was a theater major applied, auditioned for the job, I might go, yeah, Malcolm X really has to be black in this film. No one thinks that's unfair, right? Other than the fact that, it seems like it's almost a prerequisite for the film. We're just talking about in general that no one thinks it's fair to say smarter creatures get better behavior or better treatment, rather, or if you're like me, you get better treatment. What really matters when looking at the world and trying to decide how can I be fair to others, right, is whether or not the being suffers, whether, wow, I really got to work my typist here, interested creatures, whether the other suffers or not, whether we even consider and count that suffering as important, that it matters. We act in a way that hurts or helps another creature. So if I'm trying to decide how am I supposed to be a good person, do the right thing, my son, my dog Casper, you, my neighbor, presumably we would mostly think in most situations, you wouldn't say, I'll treat my better because he's got my race or color or gender, or I treat my kid better than you because he's taller, which always seems arbitrary. What Singer is going to say here in section 4, and I'm going to quote it at length here in the lecture, is he talks to Bentham and he says, how do we decide who counts? Well, how do we decide to treat others better, or at least in the right way? And he points to Bentham, is to say the capacity for suffering is the vital characteristic entitled being to equal consideration, not treatment. My dog doesn't get to vote, that's Singer's example, but actually consider everyone equally if they can all suffer. The capacity for suffering, or more strictly for suffering and enjoyment, isn't just a capacity like language or math. Bentham is not saying the insuperable line, the line between you count morally and you don't, is the line between interests that should be considered. Strike that. Bentham is not saying that those who try to mark the line that determines whether the interests of a being should be considered happen to have selected the wrong characteristic. The capacity for suffering is a prerequisite for having interest at all, right? And this is Singer. It'd be nonsense to say it was not in the interest of a stone to be kicked along the road by a schoolboy. Stone doesn't have any interest, right? My example would be my folks are from upstate New York, and we used to go to the beach on Lake Ontario, where they were from, and find these really thin rocks and skip them on the water, and then they sink. And, the more skips, the better. I don't think anyone thinks, man, you've done more wrong to that rock, right? That rock didn't want to be skipped. It wanted to be on the beach. What you would say is, well, it doesn't suffer, right? It doesn't matter. Its welfare hasn't improved or not improved as far as being a rock. On the other hand, here's this example, a mouse does have an interest in not being tormented. If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification, that's my emphasis, I'm reading the quote, for refusing to take the suffering into consideration. Again, you have to consider it, and I'll use Mill standard, in a fair, impartial, disinterested way, because suffering is suffering, doesn't make it better or worse that it's not yours, right? My pain is my pain, but it should be considered equally for the theory. No matter, I'm reading from the quote again, no matter the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that suffering be counted equally with like suffering insofar as you can make these comparisons, right? If a being is not capable of suffering, the rock, or experience enjoyment, there's nothing to be taken into account, right? Sentience is the limit, can the being suffer, is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. To mark this boundary by some other characteristic like intelligence or rationality would be arbitrary. Why not choose skin color? He uses the British spelling here, the Australian spelling. So again, back to the job interview. The candidate deserves to have his or her interests being equally considered for a job at St. Ed's, equally with every other applicant. So what doesn't matter? Height, weight, gender, sexuality, color, country of origin, a gazillion features. What does matter? To equally consider and treat fairly as an other their interest for the job, teaching ability, maybe background, academic interests. Do what you do fit with what we do? I mean, we have people that do legal and medical, environmental. Maybe the new person does, I'm trying to think of something, Catholic ethics, and no one in our department does that yet. Well, maybe if that's what we need, that's what we should consider. If we did consider the arbitrary things, race, color, gender, height, you would say, as an applicant, hey, you're not equally considering my interests. I'm going to suffer as a result of you not treating me fairly. I don't get a shot at this job, which I'm interested in. And if you look at D1, Singer's explanation here, this is paragraph 8, it explains the wrongs of racism and sexism, and he adds, not his term, but he's most famous for it, speciesism, hard to say. So racism, I don't consider the interests of people of other races equally with mine. I say whites should get the job ahead of a black person. Again, not only arbitrary and fictional, I don't believe it. Sexism, I don't consider the interests equally of people who are of other genders because, well, I just don't want to, right? I want mine first. And it seems to me you'll say, whoa, that's an ism, that's sexism. Singer's going to say, considering the interests of humans ahead of interests of non-humans, when both those creatures can feel suffering and pleasure, is speciesism. You don't have a reason, good reason, to put your interests ahead of theirs. In fact, you don't even, sorry, this is Singer talking, if you're eating meat, probably, which came from grocery store, which probably came from factory farm. I'm guessing most of you, I've only done it one summer, haven't worked on a farm and cared for animals and at the end of their life, when they died, then eaten them, right? That's not how most meat in the U.S. is produced. So his argument here is the animal does not have an interest in being killed and eaten. Most animals have an interest in doing what they do. I worked on the dairy farm. They mostly just want to eat, poop, and sleep. How do we know this? Well, you could violate that interest by harming them, and their behavior will tell you, right, they don't like it. I mean, they can't use words. So the example I'm going to use is Steve Martin, who was a philosophy major in college. He used to use this routine where he would say, I was home at night, bored, doing terrible things to my dog or cat. I can't remember which. Let's make it a cat. With a fork. Meow, meow. And everyone's, hard. It recoils in horror. Why? There's no good reason to torture a cat. It feels pain. It doesn't want to feel pain. It's going to claw back, right? Singer's argument here is sure, if it suffers, you should consider it suffering equally. You had no good reason not to consider it suffering. And in fact, in that example, it was for a stupid reason or a cruel reason. So you are like the sexist who doesn't consider women equally in treating their interests, or a racist. You are a speciesist. You come first. Now, we're in section D. There are a whole bunch of implications here. I won't get to all of these. Let's do a couple. And, if you want to write about these, they could come up as a potential paper topic. I think, yeah, it could come up. D2, what does his theory, equal consideration of interests based on sentience, which animals have, mostly, I think, pretty sure, is it slapping a horse or a baby for no good reason wrong? Well, You might argue for baby, that just sounds mean. Who slaps a baby? But a horse, I mean, I worked on a dairy farm. Even if there's no good reason, if they don't feel anything, their skin is thicker or tougher, maybe the wrong is different, right? So what he's getting at here is people are going to object to his theory like this. Oh, this is just silly, right? There are all sorts of things we do to animals that don't seem wrong, and they're going to throw things up at Singer to say, well, is that wrong? Is that wrong? And can you do this? And these are objections, and he should be able to handle at least, some of them. If you look at paragraph 12, this is section D3 in this handout, medical experiments on animals. Well, lots and lots of people do it for the benefit of human beings, right? I have a former colleague, whose spouse is at Southwestern, and she has a rat lab, and they do all sorts of chemical interventions, and then they kill the rats, and then they dissect their brains to see how the chemicals affect them. And I think, at least in part, it's probably cancer research. Isn't it right, the objection to Singer might go, to kill 5, 10, 20, 100, 1,000 in that lab every year, if potentially it could save thousands and thousands of people from cancer? So utilitarian kind of calculus, cause pain and suffering to animals that aren't us, get wonderful results that save lots of people. That seems like a utilitarian trade-off. If you read paragraph 12, Singer's going to go, well, it's not clear a lot of those experiments really do have that kind of payoff. So again, that net balance that we talked about with Mill, that calculation may be done the wrong way. But the principle here is the equal consideration of interests. Do non-human animals have an interest in not suffering? Yes, they don't like it. You inflict the pain on them, it's bad. Is the inflicting of pain on animals in medical experiments justified if it produces good results? Well, if it doesn't often produce good results, you've done the wrong calculation. You've created all this pain in animals, and you still haven't gotten the solution for the cancer, or the medical treatments for the cancer that'll prevent pain in human. But then Singer kind of throws a curveball here. He's like, okay, and it's something like this. Well, if we want medical research to benefit humans, it's one thing to model on the anatomy and physiology of a rat or a monkey or whatever, but those systems, those physiological systems, don't really match ours. What we really need is a human. And Singer's not recommending the following thing. This is a thought experiment that's supposed to press back on, we need animals for medical research. Why not use orphans? I know this sounds disgusting, whatever that comes up in class, this is awful. Or if you go to D6 here, and this is paragraph 24 through 29, orphans have irreversible brain damage. Again, Singer's not saying he'd vote for this or sign on to it. He's putting it to you. If you really want good medical research, you need medical subjects that are human. So we need to know what the drug or the cancer treatment does in humans. Why orphans? So that second and third parties aren't horrified. I mean, you still would be, as am I, but you don't have the family or the friends or the cousins. Why irreversible brain damage? No one's going to say that this terrible victim is going to mentally suffer by anticipating the harm or feeling that she or he doesn't belong in society. Again, totally fictional, but his argument is this. If you really want the net balance of pleasures and pains to be do experiments to save people, we need to pick people that maybe society doesn't care about. I know this is awful. Or have connections to, orphans, that have a kind of physical or mental challenge. I know this is just terrible. That where they're not going to live, or they're not going to live very long. That experiment is going to tell us a lot. Now, what he's counting on, and if you're doing it right now, you're in the right place, is people going, that's wrong, right? And of course, he's saying, well, why is it wrong? And your answer is, it's wrong to operate on humans for medical research, even those that give us better medical results, better cancer drugs, that aren't cared for as much because they're orphans, that are going to die anyway because they have some terminal illness. It's wrong because they're human. And at this point, Singer says, you've just argued in a circle. If you remember from our PowerPoint from 2 classes back now, why do humans count for more? Can't use intelligence, can't use race, can't use height, can't use gender. Well, they count for more because they can anticipate suffering. Oh, not this poor creature. They count for more because they matter to us. Well, not this poor creature. Orphan who's got the brain damage. I know it's awful. So then you just say, you can't use humans because they're human. There's your circularity. So what Singer's suggesting is our speciesism, humans first, right, non-human second, isn't warranted by any argument that he's going to be throwing out here, right? So, for example, if you look at D7, and I'm going to try to wrap up here because I think I'm coming up on an hour. One argument you might make against Singer's equal consideration of interest based on sentience, based on suffering and pleasure, and if I don't consider it equally, I'm prejudiced towards humans in a way that wouldn't be justified if I was prejudiced towards members of my own race or sex. This is a D7, it's in paragraphs 36 to 40. Animals eat each other, right? Jungle, right? The cheetahs chase the deer, or the antelopes, I don't know, whatever the law of the jungle is. So is it so wrong to do what we're doing? And interesting, I mean, other animals do hunt and kill other animals, I assume for food, not for sport, like humans do, but take that aside. What do you make of that? Is that a good argument? And of course, what Singer wants to say is, so the model here is if other animals do it, we can. I'm not so sure copying the animal kingdom is our best moral guide. If you think other animals are doing things that's okay for us to do, then there are lots of things they do that you probably wouldn't touch. In any case, we're supposed to be different, right? The way this argument or objection set to Singer is supposed to work is humans count for more, therefore I can use non-human animals. It seems sort of weird to turn around and then say, well, they count for more, therefore we get to use non-human animals. But we can be just like animals too if we want to. So that's paragraphs 36 to 40. The last two I want to talk about, and then I'll make a passing wave to next week's readings on Kant. Some people do want to say, and this is paragraphs 41 to 55, we're different from animals insofar as we have souls, or we use tools, or we have self-consciousness, we build cities and computers, and those things give us reason to use non-human animals in any way we like. You can go ahead and read those 15, 14 paragraphs. I'll just touch on a couple things you've probably thought about. I happen to think we have souls. As a Catholic, I've got maybe religious tradition, textual reasons for that, but proving you have a soul in a way that warrants you're using non-human animals, at least proving it philosophically, very, very difficult, right? People have been trying it for hundreds and hundreds of years. Yes, we do use tools, but so do a lot of non-human animals, so I guess that would make them count. Is it really certain that only humans are self-conscious? If you looked at some of the other links on Canvas, there is a suggestion by some researchers that other animals have self-concepts. That is, they have some idea that they are distinct from other things in the world. One last thing I'll say here, and then talk about Kant, this is D9, is Singer talks about ethics and reciprocity, which is to say that social scientists, people that study primates and the history of human evolution, will often say something like this. The reason we have ethics, scientifically, is as humans evolved, they found honoring rules of reciprocity. That is, I treat you in a fair way so as to you treat me in a fair way. You might think of this as the golden rule, is actually beneficial. That reciprocity rules lead to peaceful outcomes when there's a conflict. They allow groups not to fight over every little thing, have codes of conduct like laws, which allows humans to flourish, move from agriculture to the arts, what have you. In other words, it may be rules of reciprocity which are at the basis of our ethics rules, right? I treat you in a fair way, and anticipating that, and as a result, you'll treat me in a fair way. It may be those rules helped us develop and evolve over time. That is social contracts, right? You might think of the Constitution as one big social contract. Here's what we say the government you may do with and for us, and here's things that you may not do, right? Abridge our right to speech and press and assembly and ownership of guns and so on. So it may explain how we got our codes, but that doesn't necessarily justify our codes, right? Social contracts are just that, things we agree to do with each other, but agreements aren't always justified. And I don't need to explain this to you all, that some kinds of agreements you may enter into with other people you might consider unfair, right? It was done in an unequal arrangement, the power differences were different, or what have you. So his explanation here in 56 to 62, it's the reciprocity, is that explains how we got our ethical rules, but doesn't necessarily say why they're the best ones. So that kind of wraps up Singer. Utilitarian, equal consideration of interests if the being suffers. If you don't consider the suffering at all, you're a speciesist, the way a racist and a sexist is with respect to members of their own race, counting more, or members of their own sex or gender, counting more. Singer seems to argue there's no real good reason for most of the meat we eat from factory farming. You can go Google the videos, I won't show you. There's no good reason to think that we need that meat for protein. You can get, my girlfriend's vegan, she gets her protein in lots of other ways, and it's Austin, right? Not hard. So if you're not considering the suffering of others, especially the non-human others, and you just want your meat because steak and a beer is good, I get that, I enjoy that too. He says you don't have a moral reason for that, and you're basically just tolerating, maybe even promoting unnecessary suffering when there's an alternative. So that's the Singer. I'm going to stop here. Oh, Kant. Let me say one thing about the Kant for next time. So we're going to have a very different theorist next week. There's a little of Kant in translation. He's an Enlightenment German philosopher. Different in the following sense. He's not going to be worried about outcomes in so much, right? He's not going to say your duty morally is to produce situations where more pleasure rather than less is promoted on balance. He's going to say what matters is, as thinking rational creatures who have dignity by insofar as they are rational, he's to say what matters is treating people in a consistent, clear, reasonable fashion when you engage in behavior with them. That's when morality matters, right? It's when you're actually talking to, reacting to, acting with at least one other. Kant's going to argue really what captures our duties are systems of rules and principles where you never treat somebody else as merely an object, because that would dehumanize them or treat them merely as a tool. And how do you do that? You, and for the most part, get them to agree, consent to be involved with some course of action that you're involved with. And if you do that, you're effectively saying, I respect your wishes, your plans, your behavior, your autonomy, your decisions to decide your own life by your own lights. And once you agree to work with me or not, then I've treated you as an equal. Again, where that heads, it might produce more pleasure for society, it might not. Kant thinks that's a really hard thing to calculate. What Kant's concerned about are the clear and consistent rules that treat other agents, other people, as what he calls rational beings or rational ends in themselves. So anyway, that's just a preview of where we're headed for next week. As usual, once I post this, you can show up in my Zoom office hours to talk about it. You can show up in Zoom office hours to talk about papers, brainstorm a paper, or you've got a couple sentences in your head. Just because we're online and asynchronous doesn't mean we have to be distant from one another. So I will see you in the next recording.